The three lectures advertised form a single long lecture, and I have summarized the main points I am going to talk about on that sheet of paper. What I will do is talk for about half an hour and then pause and take questions, and I will be happy if you wish to ask questions in Italian. I will do my best to understand them. And then maybe we have 15 minutes discussion, then I will resume the thing, because I find that when I go on talking for more than half an hour, I notice heads beginning to nod. And so I think it is better to space out what I'm going to say. My topic is happiness, with special reference to Thomas Aquinas, but I want to talk much more broadly, over a much broader front, about the nature of happiness. I suppose I should begin by asking whether you all want to be happy. I noticed in an interview that I gave to the newspaper that at one point it said that those who don't want to be happy should raise their hands. But philosophers throughout history have taken for granted that everybody wishes to be happy. They thought that it was the task of philosophy to explain what happiness was and to ask how is it to be achieved, how does one gain happiness. In the Confessions of St Augustine, he says that if you ask two people whether they want to join the army, some may say yes and some may say no. But if you ask them whether they want to be happy, they'll all say yes, without hesitation. And the reason that they differ about going into the army is that one thinks that is a way to be happy and the other doesn't. Now, in recent times, there has grown up what is optimistically called a science of happiness. It is not, in my view, a very rigorous science, but around the world, opinion pollsters, taking sondaggi, they go around asking people, are you taking your life as a whole? They say, would you consider yourself very happy, moderately happy, or not happy at all? Or they will say, on a scale of 1 to 7, from utterly miserable to very happy, where would you place yourself? On the basis of many such questionnaires, some social scientists have claimed to create a science of happiness. You may be gratified and perhaps a little surprised to know that commonly the results of these polls show that a majority of people think they are quite happy. Well, what are we to make of these findings of the social scientists? They have been taken quite seriously by economists who have used them as the basis for policy recommendations. And I understand that, I think it's in the Kingdom of Nepal, there is now a gross happiness quotient, which is used instead of the gross national product as a measure of the success of the economy. Now, one of the most interesting results of the polls is that they suggest that above a certain minimum level of income, the amount of money somebody has does not make much difference to how happy they feel themselves to be. There have been a few decades since these happiness studies began, and in the most developed countries over that period, average incomes have more than doubled. And yet, people's answers to the pollsters during the same period suggests that they're very little happier, if at all. Some economists and some politicians have drawn the conclusion that economic policy should be attached should be aimed not at increase in growth, but at increase in factors that correlate more closely with reported happiness. Now, philosophers tend to be rather skeptical about the results of these questionnaires, and they have raised a number of questions about their methodology. First of all, is each person in the best position to pronounce accurately about his or her own happiness? An expression of contentment is a judgment not about a momentary sensation, but about a long-term state of mind. And a person reporting on their own happiness doesn't have the overriding authority that she would have if she were reporting a dream or a pain. It's possible for claims about one's happiness to be mistaken and later to be revised. You may say, in those days I thought I was happy, but now I know better. Or, oh, if only I had realized how happy I was then. Again, if somebody gives a positive answer to an inquiry about how happy they are, it may be that report may be falsified by other aspects of his behavior. I mean, if he is regularly quarreling with his family and his friends, if he's constantly trying to change his job, if he exhibits some symptoms of psychosomatic illness, it may be quite reasonable to discard the evidence, even if he gave it in good faith. And moreover, not all evidence is given in good faith. People may have reasons for not giving a sincere answer to an inquiry about their happiness. Self-ascriptions may be misleading. It may be that somebody is too proud to reveal that he's miserable. It may be that he is superstitious about boasting of happiness. And perhaps the people being asked the questions may belong to a culture or occupy a status in which it is quite wrong to complain or to boast. Or somebody may refuse to give the answer that springs to mind, if any answer at all, because one regards the whole question and answer technique as futile or impertinent. So, for these methodological reasons, many philosophers are skeptical about the results of happiness science. On the other hand, philosophers themselves are not all that well placed to give authoritative answers about the nature of happiness, as we shall see if we survey the history of philosophy from Plato to Kant. We find a great deal of misunderstanding, or certainly a variety of ways of understanding the notion of happiness and of the relationship between happiness and morality. Hardly any two thinkers would give the same set of answers to the following set of questions. Is happiness something subjective or objective? Is it a sensation detectable at a single moment? Or is it the quality of an entire life? Is it a motive for endeavour, or is it a state of satisfaction? Does everyone, in fact, pursue happiness? Should everyone, as a matter of morals, pursue happiness? Is it something achievable at will, or something that depends on factors outside oneself? However it is brought about, is happiness something to be hoped for in this life, or only in some life after death? Is happiness the key concept that determines the structure of morality? And if so, is it the happiness of the individual, or the general happiness that stands at the apex of the moral system? Can I ask if I am intelligible? Should I speak slower or faster? It's okay? Fine, good. Thank you. Now, sorry?
You make us happy.
If one of the earliest to ask the question, what is happiness, was Aristotle, you'll see that we are now up to point 3 on the handout. Now, the definition that he offers just as a starting point is that happiness is the supreme good that supplies the purpose and measures the value of all human activity and striving. It is for the sake of happiness, he wrote, that we do everything that we do. That's a quotation from his Nicomachean Ethics, 1102. B3. So, 1102 A3. Now, Aristotle, I think, is not trying to rule out the possibility of there being impulsive actions done for fun, without relation to any overarching scheme of happiness. But what he means rather is that if you plan your life, as he thinks you should, then your top priority, your overarching goal, will show what you take to be what you take to be a worthwhile life, and then what you mean by happiness. Of course, Aristotle doesn't have the word happiness, since he knew a lot of things but he didn't know English. His Greek word is eudaimonia, and it's traditionally translated happiness in English, and I think felicità in Italian. The translations are not exact, and it might in some ways be better in English to call eudaimonia a worthwhile life, but I will stick to the traditional version. Now, Aristotle knew very well that human beings have a great variety of opinions about what makes them happy. Some sensible ideas and some crazy ideas. But whatever they present as their ultimate ambition, he thinks that it must, as a matter of logic, pass certain tests if it is genuinely to count as happiness. For there are two features that he thinks, two features that must be present. One is that happiness must be an end rather than a means. We may do other things for the sake of happiness, but we can't be happy, seek happy, as a means to some other end. You may, of course, find that being cheerful helps you to make money and adopt a cheerful frame of mind for that reason. But that just shows, Aristotle would say, that cheerfulness is something different from happiness, and if your ultimate aim is to make money for its own sake, then that indicates that you believe that money is the point of everything, that happiness is to be found in riches. He thought, of course, that was a wrong belief. So he insists that happiness is always sought for its own sake and never for the sake of something else, the finality of happiness. And the second thing that he thinks is a feature of happiness is that it must be self-sufficient. That is to say, it must be some good or set of goods that in itself makes life worth living. One's life can't be truly happy if there's something missing that is an essential ingredient of a worthwhile existence. Moreover, a happy life, so far as human nature allows, should be something invulnerable to bad luck. Otherwise, the constant fear of losing one's happiness will diminish the happiness itself. So happiness, Aristotle concludes, must have the properties of independence and stability. On the basis of these definitional features, Aristotle was in a position to move on to the second question. In what does happiness consist? He goes through a number of candidates, a number of things that people have thought constituted happiness, and he rules them out fairly quickly. He settles for a short list of 3 candidates for happiness, namely a life of pleasure, a life of politics, and a life of study. The pursuit of wealth he knocks out very early on as being not seriously worth considering as happiness, because he says money is only as good as what you can get with it. And it's how somebody spends their money that shows what they really think of as happiness. We can ask, if somebody's made a great deal of money, well, what does he do with it? Does he spend it on luxury? Does he buy yachts and racehorses? Does he use it to gain political power? Or does he give it away to those who are less well off. What he does with it will show what he really thinks is what makes life worthwhile. Now, what was Aristotle's own choice as the ideal life? Well, there isn't a single answer to that question, because Aristotle wrote more than one treatise on happiness and gave different accounts in different treatises. But in all of them, he does give a definition of happiness as activity in accordance with virtue. That's to say, doing well something that you are good at and that is worth doing. In the best known of his treatises, the Nicomachean Ethics, he identified happiness with the enjoyment of philosophical study, or the fruits of philosophical study. The life of the philosopher, he thought, provided the best fit to the definitional features of happiness, of finality, self-sufficiency, stability, and so on. Well, what are we to think of Aristotle's identifying happiness with the study of philosophy? Since we're all students of philosophy, presumably we think it's something to do with happiness, but is it the one and only way to be happy? Some people find Aristotle's view engaging, rather charming, that he should think that doing what he did was the best possible way to be happy. Others find it enormously irritating and snobbish to think that the leisurely life of a philosopher is the one thing worth doing. I think very few people have found the view credible. Perhaps Aristotle didn't do so himself, because he wrote another ethical treatise, not very well known, the Eudemian Ethics. And I have to say that if I have one complaint with the introduction of Professor Ventimiglia, was that he did not present a commercial for my translation of the Eudemian Ethics in Oxford World's Classics. I think his bag was big enough, probably, that he could have brought that as well. However, I'm not going to talk long about the Eudemian Ethics, but just to say that in that ethics, unlike the better-known Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says that happiness is the pursuit of all the virtues, not just the intellectual virtue of philosophy, but the practical virtues of courage, benevolence, friendship, and that kind of thing. He thinks that the happy person, though must go in for some philosophy even in the Eudemian Ethics, but he mustn't be a purely contemplative philosopher, but must possess and exercise the practical virtues that are necessary for the pursuit of worthwhile ambitions. Somebody who is really virtuous will find virtuous action in pursuit of worthwhile goals a pleasure and not a burden. It's wrong, Aristotle says, to think that the only pleasures are the pleasures of the senses, but those too, the sensual pleasures, must have a role in the happy life. They must be enjoyed in accordance with the virtue of temperance, sophrosyne, a virtue which in Aristotle's view is violated not only by an excess of food and drink and sex, but also by a lack of the appropriate amount of food and drink and sex. Now, the kind of ideal life which assigns a role to philosophy, to the practical virtues, and to the pleasures of mind and body. These relate to Aristotle's original short list of happy lives: the life of the philosopher, the life of the politician, and the life of the pleasure seeker. The happy man will value contemplation, philosophical contemplation above all, but part of his happy life will be the exercise of political virtues and the enjoyment in moderation of natural human pleasures. Having defined pleasure to his own satisfaction, Aristotle then goes on to ask the question, how is it acquired? And he offers a number of candidate answers to how do you achieve happiness. He says, does it come about by nature, by training, by learning, by luck, or by divine favor? Now, each item on Aristotle's list has been seized on by one or other later thinker as crucial. Some have claimed that happiness is in our genes, therefore it's by nature. Some have written books telling you how to become happy. Others have thought that there was a regime to be followed, which, if scrupulously followed, would make you happy. Others have thought that there was a secret science which would bring happiness to the initiate. And others have thought that happiness is owed above all to a fortunate environment, and therefore is partly a matter of luck. But finally, for many centuries, the dominant account was that supreme happiness was a gift of God, obtainable only through divine grace. And I'm going to stop at that point. You will see that we have got to the end of point 4 on the handout, and I'll stop for a moment and pause for questions. Okay.
I think that should be contemplated how much the enrichment of happiness, given as assumed the point that very few can declare themselves very happy as teachers of happiness. Most of the people is looking for their own way of reaching happiness. Mm-hmm. Now, the way you make these people feel enthusiastic or infatuated about something, make them be happy to die, as the Christian did at the very beginning of the Catholic religion, or the Islamic do now with the Islamic
suicide bombers,
or can be happy of different things. So I think that you should evaluate the happiness on a term of period during which the general human being, or the human being of one nation at the time, has been taught that the parameter of happiness are built by information and by self-enthusiasm in what they do.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm
the
interested.
longer is the time, the more people you can share your happiness with, and the more you are sure that that is the right way to be happy. If you are only taught that making money is the way to be happy for 12 years of your life, it's very difficult that you do something different after that. Or if you are taught that happiness is go with one woman only after 33 years old, you see, it's something that at the very beginning of life must be very much taken into consideration.
Well,
for a long time.
I'm interested that your starting point, because you were really saying what I was about to say in the next paragraph, when I start to consider the Christian views of happiness, so I will return to that in a moment. But let me say now that, of course, I agree with you, and Aristotle also would agree with you, that it is essential that happiness be viewed as a long-term thing, that it's quite different from momentary feelings of contentment. He raises the question whether it is right to say, call no man happy till he is dead. And he says that is a bit paradoxical, that it's only after somebody has ceased to be happy that you can call him happy. But what he says is that if you have a right view of happiness, it won't prevent you from the risk of losing it. He says King Priam of Troy was one of the happiest of human beings, but then when the Greeks destroyed Troy, he ceased to be happy. But he says if you are ever truly happy, then you will never become utterly miserable, because as part of building up your happiness, you will have acquired the kind of virtue that enables you to make the best of what happens to you, even if it is something very sad. You won't become a wretched person, even if you lose all your sort of earthly happiness. But he makes a distinction between two Greek words. There's eudaimonia for happiness, and there is also the word makarios, which is usually translated blessed in English, and beatitudo versus felicitas in Latin. And he says that no human being can, during his lifetime, claim the title blessed or beatus. Only the gods can do that. But if you are eudaimon, if you are happy through your life and then you die, you can be said to have had not just a happy life, but a blessed life. And I think since you introduced it, I might go on to Augustine at this point. Now, like everyone in the ancient world, Augustine starts from the premise that everyone wants to be happy, and he accepts that it is the task of philosophy to define what this supreme good is and how it is to be achieved. Like Aristotle, he thinks happiness is the supreme good. It's the good that provides the standard of our actions. It's sought for its own sake, and it is not a means to an end. And once we attain it, we lack nothing that is necessary for happiness. But then he takes a step that goes well beyond Aristotle. He says that real happiness is truly possible only in an afterlife, in the vision of God, the beatific vision, the vision that makes us makarios. First of all, he argues that anyone who wants to be happy must want to be immortal, must want to live forever. He says, how can we hold that a happy life is to come to an end at death? If a man is unwilling to lose his life, how can he be happy with that prospect of losing his life always before him? If death is the end, then the prospect of death, of the end of our happy life, is always before us. On the other hand, if his life is something he is willing to part with, how can it have been truly happy. But if immortality is necessary for happiness, of course, it's not sufficient. Pagan philosophers who have claimed to prove that the soul is immortal have also held out the prospect of a miserable cycle of reincarnation. And according to Augustine, only the Christian faith promises everlasting happiness for the whole human being, body and soul alike. And now at this point I want to start talking at last about Thomas Aquinas, because his treatment of happiness, like his treatment of many topics, combines elements both from Aristotle and from Augustine. Aquinas agrees with both of them that everyone necessarily desires happiness, and he agrees with Augustine that happiness is truly to be found only in the beatific vision of God after death. Aquinas is very anxious, of course, to reconcile the teaching of Aristotle on many topics with Christian theology. But it's interesting, if you read through the works of St. Thomas, that he takes Aristotle's texts, the ones we've been considering, but he puts them to quite different uses in the different contexts. And I will consider in numbers 6 to 9 4 different approaches which Aquinas makes to Aristotle, depending on what he's writing about. To put it very crudely, whether Aquinas at any given moment is writing as an Aristotelian, as a Christian, as a Catholic, or as a Dominican. In his commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, Aquinas is writing as an Aristotelian, in the sense that his primary aim is to set forth Aristotle's teaching rather than to put forward his own opinion on the matters under discussion. And from time to time, he draws attention to places where, from a Christian point of view, Aristotle falls short of the truth. He does that, but overwhelmingly in the commentary on the Ethics, his concern is to expound Aristotle rather than to criticize Aristotle. And it's a sign of his genius, I think, of the genius of St. Thomas, that even though he knows Aristotle only in Latin translation, his commentary is remarkably clear and accurate, and in my view, he often grasps Aristotle's meaning, where 20th century commentators who have a perfect mastery of Greek have actually missed Aristotle's meaning. I mentioned that though Aristotle makes clear that happiness is the exercise of virtue, there are questions about how many virtues are exercised in happiness. And modern interpreters of the Nicomachean Ethics don't agree whether in there he takes it as the exercise of a single dominant virtue or as the inclusive exercise of the virtues of the rational soul. And I think that for much of the last century, a majority of writers of English have favored the inclusive interpretation of the Nicomachean Ethics, the one that I gave of the Eudemian Ethics. When Aristotle says that the good for man is, quote, activity of soul in accordance with virtue, and if there are several virtues, in accordance with the best and most perfect virtue. That's what Aristotle says in the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics, and many commentators take it that the most perfect virtue means the totality of virtues. That quote was 1098a, 17 to 18. Activity of soul in accordance with virtue, and if there are several virtues, in accordance with the best and most perfect. Now, a lot of commentators take the best and most perfect virtue to be the totality of virtues, both moral and intellectual. Now, St. Thomas in his commentary won't have any of this, and in my view he's quite right. He says the human virtue, human good, happiness, is activity in accordance with virtue, such that if there is only one human virtue, the activity which is in accordance with that will be happiness. But if there are several human virtues, happiness will be the activity which is in accordance with the best of them. Now, it turns out at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics in Book 10 that the best of the human virtues is Sophia, which is the virtue of philosophical understanding, of the virtue whose exercise.
The name Philosophia, no?
Sorry?
Philosophia.
Yes, that's right. It is, Sophia is related to Philosophia as achievement to enterprise. Philosophy, the love of Sophia, is the activity we engage in when we are setting ourselves the task of achieving Sophia, which is a philosophical understanding of the world. It's different from episteme, which is science. Sophia is understanding rather than science. I myself believe that that is the correct account of the relation between science and philosophy. That whereas science seeks new information about the world, philosophy doesn't seek new information. I don't think the philosopher knows anything that the non-philosopher does, but the philosopher seeks the understanding of what the scientist will tell us. If you wish to...
Sorry to interrupt, but again, we go to something that we have faith with. Just to assume two extreme examples. Mother Teresa of Calcutta, maybe she was going to be very happy because she was making so many lives saved and so many people, poor people, happy. Hitler was very happy because he was clearing the humanity from the Zionists. So they both can be happy on their own view. The point is to understand who is giving the real parameter of happiness. Because happiness is a status of animus that you have in a longer possible moment. But it's always relative to what you feel like your happiness is.
You're taking a very different view from the one that I'm taking. I don't think Hitler was ever happy, and I don't think happiness is a subjective matter, nor did Aristotle, nor did Aquinas. They think that it is an objective question, what true happiness consists in. Now, they give different answers, but they think it's an objective one, and none of them would say that Hitler was happy.
But who knows he was happy?
I'm saying that the individual does not necessarily know whether he is happy or not.
Okay.
That it is an objective matter.
So it's a matter of a superior life judgment. That's why the life cannot end with happiness, because to be happy for the whole life, you have to live many lives.
Right. Does anybody else want to ask a question? Right. So at the moment we're talking about Aquinas as an interpreter of Aristotle. I know you want to go further. We will go further,
okay,
but
just for a
yeah.
point of view.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I was saying that in Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, the best human virtue is Sophia, or understanding, namely the activity which is the result of successful pursuit of philosophy. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Aristotle said that it's a characteristic of happiness that it has to be perfect or complete. Now, Aquinas, commenting on that, says that there are some things which are desirable only because they are useful, and his example is some nauseating medicine which you take only for the sake of health. But he says there are other things which are desirable for their own sake as well as for the sake of something else. And his example is a warm and tasty medicine. We don't know quite what he had in mind, but I think of hot whiskey toddy, which you take to ward off a cold before you go to sleep. It is both pleasant and useful. And he says that second kind of good, things that are desirable for their own sake and for the sake of something else, is more perfect than the first. But the most perfect good is one which is desired only for its own sake and never for the sake of anything else. And he says that an end such as wealth, money, which is always chosen for the sake of something else, is imperfect, therefore it can't be identified with happiness. The best end, the ultimate end, must be perfect. Optimus autem finis, qui est ultimus, oportet quod sit perfectus. Unde, si unum solum sit tale, oportet hoc esse ultimum finem quem querimus. Si autem sint multi perfecti fines, oportet quod perfectissimus horum sit optimus et ultimus. The best end, which is the ultimate end, must be perfect. If then there is one such end, this must be the ultimate end we're looking for. But if there are many perfect ends, then it's the most perfect of these which is the best and ultimate. Now, Aquinas understands Aristotle as saying that there are several perfect ends: honor, pleasure, intelligence, and virtue. But he thinks they are not the most perfect, because we choose honor and pleasure, etc., not only for their own sake, but also for the sake of happiness. Some people pursue pleasure for the sake of happiness. Aristotle gave, as I mentioned at the beginning, self-sufficiency as another characteristic of happiness. And some people have taken this to indicate that happiness must include many other goods in addition to the exercise of contemplation. But Aquinas interprets the text quite differently, and in my view, correctly. He says, the happiness about which he is now talking is self-sufficient because it contains in itself everything which is necessary, but not everything which could come to someone. So it can become better with any other addition. This does not mean that the person's desire remains unsatisfied, since desire which is regulated by reason, such as the happy person's must be, is not troubled about things which are unnecessary, even if they can be acquired. I'll give the Latin for that. Et sic felicitas, de qua nunc loquitur, habet de se sufficientiam, quia in se continet omne illud, quod est in se necessarium, non autem omne illud, quod potest omni advenire, unde potest melior fieri, alico alio adito, non tamen remenet desiderium hominis inquietum, quia desiderium ratione regulatum, quale oportat esse felicis, non habet inquietudinem de his, quae non sunt necessaria, licet sint possibilia adipisci. So, Aristotle, having summed up his teaching on perfect happiness by saying that the life of the intellect is the best and pleasantest and happiest life for humans, since a human being is above all an intellect, he then goes on to say, secondly, there is a happiness in accordance with the other virtues, for activities in accordance with it are human too. For we display justice and courage and the other virtues in our dealings with one another. He's saying that there is a secondary kind of happiness, the life of the moral virtues. And that's the way Aquinas understands the passage in his commentary. He says, the person devoted to the contemplation of truth is the happiest of all. But happy in a secondary manner is the person who lives in accordance with the other virtues, namely wisdom, which is the guide of all the moral virtues. Ille qui vacet speculatione veritatis sit felicissimus, secundario est felix, ille qui vivit secundum aliam virtutem, scilicet secundum prudentiam, quae dirigit omnes morales virtutes. In all the passages about happiness in Aristotle that I've considered, Aquinas' interpretation seems to me preferable to the many alternative interpretations that have been canvassed by modern philosophers. It's not that Aristotle doesn't have the idea of happiness as the exercise of all the virtues, but as I've said, it's in the Eudemian, not the Nicomachean ethics, that it's to be found. And I think Aquinas is correct in taking Aristotle's Nicomachean view to be that perfect happiness consists in theoretical contemplation and in that alone. But then, of course, there is the question, can we achieve that in this life or afterwards only? There's no, to my mind, there's no utterly clear answer in Aristotle to this, but of course Aquinas goes on to give an answer to it, which I will consider in a moment, but I'll take another break here, and I hope if people would feel happier to ask questions in Italian, I would rather that than that people don't ask questions at all.
Excuse me, could you give us the last quotation from Aquinas?
The Latin.
No,
Oh,
not
no.
the Latin. Where it lies, in which text?
It's commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics 10:12. It's paragraph 2111 in the Spiazzi edition. Okay, well,
I may ask a question,
yeah.
but it's out of the... No, it's okay. Sorry. I have to take orders from the... no, it's okay.
Well, now I move on to the Christianization of Aristotle by Aquinas. As a Christian, Aquinas wanted to reconcile Aristotle's theory of happiness with the teaching of the Bible and the Church. And of course, the most authoritative Christian statement on the nature of happiness is the set of Beatitudes recorded in St Matthew's Gospel as part of the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. And blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, St Matthew's Greek word, which is in that traditional English translation is blessed, is this word makarios, the one for the superior kind of happiness in Aristotle. Modern English translations of St Matthew often use the word happy instead of blessed. Blessed has a slightly archaic flavour in English. Aquinas uses the Latin word felix as the equivalent of eudaimon, and felicitas as the equivalent of eudaimonia when he's discussing Aristotle. But when he's discussing happiness on his own account, he uses the word beatitudo. I think in Aquinas there is not really a difference between the meaning of felicitas and beatitudo. And it is the word beatus which occurs in the Beatitudes, in those words of St Matthew which I've quoted. Now in question 69 of the Prima Secunda, Aquinas discusses the Beatitudes, and he offers, surprisingly, to tell us what the structure of the Beatitudes is by reference to the section of the Nicomachean Ethics where Aristotle listed 3 opinions about happiness. The place where he said some identify it with pleasure, some with the active life, and some with the contemplative life. Taking his cue from that passage, Aquinas tells us that the life of pleasure is an impediment to true happiness, and the active life is a preparation for true happiness, and the contemplative life is what it essentially consists in. So Aquinas then applies this in a rather surprising manner to the Beatitudes. He says, the first 3 show that happiness demands the rejection of the life of pleasure. The poor in spirit reject riches and honours. The meek suppress the passions of anger. And those who mourn are those who abstain from the satisfaction of concupiscence. And he says the next 2 Beatitudes are concerned with the active life. Those who hunger and thirst after righteousness are those with a passion to carry out their duties to their neighbour. Those who are merciful are those who are in service to their neighbour, and those who others go beyond the cause of duty and kinship and consider only the needs of their fellows. Finally, he says, the remaining Beatitudes express the happiness of the contemplative life. The sixth Beatitude speaks of the vision of God, which is promised to the pure in heart. And the seventh, the one about the peacemakers, is explained in this way, quote, to make peace in oneself or among others shows that a person is an imitator of God, who is the God of unity and peace, and so its reward is the glory of divine sonship. I quote, constituere vero pacem vel in se ipso vel inter alios, manifestat hominem esse Dei imitatorem, qui est Deus unitatis et pacis. Et ideo pro premio reditur ei gloria divinae filiationis, quae est in perfecta conjunctione ad Deum per sapientiam consummatam. And this sonship, the filiatio, is identified by Aquinas with the perfect union with God, which is brought about by the supreme contemplative virtue. Now, I think I find quite surprising this endeavor. It's a particularly dramatic way of Christianizing Aristotle, bringing this Nicomachean passage together with the passage of St. Matthew. I don't think it can be regarded as totally successful. I think of the first three Beatitudes, only the first can plausibly be represented as describing the renunciation of the life of pleasure. I think when the Saviour talks of those who, blessed are they that mourn, it is a bit fanciful to take the word mourn to refer to the suppression of concupiscence. And the control of anger and the pursuit of honour are actually elements of the second life, the life of action, rather than the first life, the renunciation of pleasure. The fourth and fifth Beatitudes fit quite well. Love of righteousness and mercy would no doubt be attributes of anybody who was a worthy pursuer of the Aristotelian active life. And purity of heart is a condition of the contemplation of God, both in the Eudemian ethics and in the Gospel. But I think when we come to the last two Beatitudes, the thread is lost, really. Peacemaking belongs to the active life and not the contemplative life. And when it comes to the suffering of persecution, Thomas himself gives up the attempt to match the two systems. What is remarkable about the rapprochement is not, I think, that it's done successfully, but that it's done at all. And what is most surprising is that when there's a certain distortion in the match, it's the Christian texts that get distorted to fit the Aristotelian model rather than the other way round. That is the end of Aquinas as commentator on the Beatitudes, number 7. I'll conclude with some remarks about, of course, the most important of his works, the Summa Theologiae. Now, in the Summa, as I hope those of you who've had the reading list have been looking, the happiness is a principal topic at the beginning of the Secunda Secundae, and it is again structured very similarly to Aristotle's the structure of Aristotle's ethics. Again, he takes as his text that Aristotle's dictum is happiness, that happiness is activity in accord with perfect virtue. That's Prima Secundae 3:2. And it's an activity not of our senses but of our intellect, and within of our intellectual soul, and within the intellectual part of us, it's the activity of the intellect, not of the will. That intellectualism of St. Thomas came under severe criticism from later Christian theologians. Now, the enjoyment of the activity of contemplation is no doubt an activity of the will, but the enjoyment is subsequent to, not constitutive of, the activity in which happiness consists. Now, up to this point, Aquinas again is in entire accord with Aristotle, and indeed the arguments which he uses to establish that happiness is an activity of the speculative intellect, they're all drawn from the last book of the Nicomachean Ethics. I'll give one or two quotes to illustrate. If human happiness is an activity, it must be the best human activity. But the best human activity is the activity of the best faculty in respect of the best object. But the best faculty is the intellect, and its best object is divine goodness, which is the object not of the practical, but of the speculative intellect. Therefore, it is that activity, namely the contemplation of divine things, in which happiness principally consists. I'll give you the text in Latin. Si beatitudo hominis est operatio, oportet quod sit optima operatio hominis. Optima autem operatio hominis est quae est optime potentiae respectu optimi objecti. Optima autem potentia est intellectus, cuius optimum objectum est bonum divinum. Quod quidem non est objectum practici intellectus, sed speculativi. Unde in tali operatione silicet in contemplatione divinorum maxime consistit beatitudo. And even the theological argument that he gives in favor of this definition of happiness is in fact drawn with slight modification from Aristotle. He said, the same conclusion is drawn from the fact that the contemplative life is something a human being shares with superhuman beings, namely God and angels, to which happiness assimilates. But the things which belong to the active life are things which are shared by other animals, though imperfectly. Tertio, idem apparet ex hoc quod, in vita contemplativa, homo communicat cum superioribus, scilicet cum Deo et angelis, quibus per beatitudinem assimilatur. Sed in hisque pertinent ad vitam activam, etiam alia animalia cum homine aliqualiter communicant, licet imperfecte. Now that is almost exactly a quotation from Aristotle, only with the words God and angels, replacing the word gods in the Greek. Now at this point, Aquinas does improve on Aristotle by making a distinction between the perfect happiness to be enjoyed in a future life, which consists in contemplation alone, and the imperfect happiness, which is all that we can hope for in the present life. And he says it's only imperfect happiness which Aristotle is writing about. I quote, "The imperfect happiness which can be had in this life consists primarily and principally in contemplation, but secondarily in the operation of practical reason, directing human actions and passions, as is said in the 10th book of the Ethics. Beatitudo autem imperfecta, qualis hic haberi potest, primo quidem et principaliter consistit in contemplatione, secundario vero in operatione practici intellectus ordinantis actiones et passiones humanas." Now, Aquinas doesn't claim the authority of Aristotle for the link which he makes between the Nicomachean theory of contemplative happiness and the Christian doctrine of the beatific vision. But it seems to me that it is not an illegitimate development of Aristotelian theory. Aquinas says candidly that the account of happiness given by Aristotle concerns a happiness obtainable in the present everyday world. But Aquinas draws attention to hints in Aristotle's Book 10 that happiness is something superhuman, and that the intellect in which happiness primarily resides is something whose activity is separable from the body. And he links these hints in Aristotle to Aristotle's teaching in the De Anima about the independence of the active intellect. In, of course, discussing the beatific vision itself, which is the perfect happiness obtainable only in the afterlife and obtainable only by the gratuitous gift of God, is something where Aquinas is drawing much more on the Augustinian tradition than the Aristotelian tradition. But the distinction that he draws between the imperfect happiness of the present life and the perfect happiness of the divine vision corresponds to an ambiguity in Aristotle himself. At one moment, Aristotle will say that perfect human happiness consists in contemplation because that is the best activity of the most human thing in us, namely the intellect, the nous. But at another time he will say that the life of contemplation is something superhuman, malone katanthropon. And Aristotle encourages us to immortalize as much as possible, identifying ourselves not with our complex human nature, but with its intellectual element. And Aristotle's clinching argument for identifying perfect happiness with contemplation is the one that Aquinas referred to, namely that of all human activities, contemplation is, of all human activities, the one which is most akin to the activity of God. Now, Aquinas' treatment of happiness in the Prima Secundae may be seen as an attempt to resolve this problem. He says that a full understanding of human nature shows that the deepest needs of human beings, the deepest aspirations of human beings, can't be satisfied in the human activities of a rational animal, even the speculative activities of a rational animal. Human beings can only be perfectly happy if they can share the superhuman activities of the divine, and for that they need the supernatural assistance of divine grace. Thus, in Article 5 of Question 5 of the Prima Secundae, he puts the question, can human beings, by natural means, acquire happiness? And he replies, the imperfect happiness which can be obtained in this life can be acquired by human beings by natural means, in the same way as the virtues in whose exercise it consists. But perfect human happiness consists in the vision of the divine essence, and to see God in his essence is above the nature not only of human beings but of all creatures. Beatitudo imperfecta, quae in hac vita haberi potest ab homine acquiri per sua naturalia, eo modo quod virtus in cuius operatione consistit. Sed beatitudo hominis perfecta consistit in visione divinae essentiae, videre autem Deum per essentiam est supranaturam non solum hominis, sed etiam omnis creaturae. One might wonder whether this teaching of Aquinas, after all the time when he's been following Aristotle very closely, doesn't this fly in the face of the Aristotelian doctrine of nature and of natural teleology? Well, Aquinas sees the objection, and he puts the objection to himself. Nature does not fail to provide what is necessary, but nothing is more necessary for human beings than the means of reaching their final end. After all, nature gives irrational creatures all they need to achieve their ends. Why not then to human beings also? And Aquinas' reply is that nature has provided for the bodily necessities of human beings not by giving them fur and claws like animals, but by giving them reasons to invent artifacts and hands to use artifacts. And similarly, he says, nature has not given humans a natural capacity for supreme happiness, but instead has given them free will by which they can turn to God, who alone can make them happy. Humans are better off than animals, even though, unlike animals, they need outside assistance to achieve their goal. He says, just as A is in a better state with regard to health than B, if A can reach perfect health but only with the aid of medication, while B is capable only of imperfect health, even though he can reach it without medical health. Melius est dispositus ad sanitatem, qui potest consequi perfectam sanitatem, licet hoc sit per auxilium medicinae, quamqui solum potest consequi quandam imperfectam sanitatem sine medicinae auxilio. I think that Aquinas' development of Nicomachean doctrine shouldn't be regarded as a perverse assimilation to Christian dogma. I think Aristotle would have been surprised at some of the uses to which Aquinas put his treatise, but he could hardly complain that he was completely distorting its meaning. In chapter 7 of book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, there is a tension between nature and supernature, clear for all to read. That's as far as I'm going to go this morning. I will start this afternoon with the consideration of the special twist that Aquinas gives to Aristotle when he is discussing the vocation of the Dominican order. So I don't know if you would like to ask some questions in the last remaining few minutes.
Talking to the modern philosopher, because I found a link between my previous question.
Mm-hmm.
In the independence that the human being has to find happiness, with respect to the animal, that are compared before the human being is an animal if you compare to God and the angels. So if the Latin language was still in use in the whole Roman Empire, how much the increase or decrease in the statistics that you have done at the beginning? Because if you speak the same, I mean, you also go to Latin to refer on something precise. If the instruction of use to human being was given in one language, maybe the total number of human beings that can understand and share happiness was much bigger than having spread the communication language in many and more languages now with the computer and the new terms, etc., etc. So I think the more we go in one direction to reach the happiness as human beings, and the more happiness can be visible to us, one by one, or language by language, or town by town, or having a car instead of another by another.
That's a very interesting question, because there have been some of these empirical studies have tried to take into account diversity of languages in a community to see whether it is a positive or negative, correlated positively or negatively with self-ascribed happiness of this kind. And for obvious reasons, Switzerland has been the community which has been most often studied in this. Sadly, I cannot remember what the results of these inquiries were. But to give my own answer to your question, I don't think that it would conduce to universal happiness if Latin was the universal language, because Latin is a comparatively inflexible language. It is certainly not a good language to use for philosophy. The fact that it lacks definite and indefinite articles leads to all kinds of ambiguity. I think the clearest philosopher writing in Latin is undoubtedly Thomas Aquinas. Descartes wrote very well in Latin too. But we do, of course, have a language that is now almost universal, namely English, which in a number of ways I think is more subtle than Latin. But I personally regard it as a factor diminishing human happiness, that English is becoming a universal language and driving out some of the great rich variety of other languages. And of course, if everybody spoke as Shakespeare wrote, it would be a marvelous thing. But of course, the English as a universal language is not even very good English. And I sympathize very much, say, with people in France who object to the way that everything now seems to have to be done in English. And I apologize. No, I don't apologize because I was told to do so by Giovanni, but I am aware of the imperfections of communication, speaking English to people whose native language is something different. And I ask your forgiveness for any incomprehensibility in what I said. Thank you. I will see you after lunch, I hope.